Hey, welcome back to Military Aviation History, and I today want to talk once again about the Russian Air Force. Actually, not the Air Force particular, but the Russian air industry. Now, that might seem like a little bit of a boring subject, but it is not, because a lot of the problems that we're seeing right now that Russia is facing, or the VKS, or the Russian Aerospace Forces are facing in Ukraine, can be more or less explained also by looking at the air industry, not just now, but over the past decade. So to shed some light on that, I once again speak to Stanimir Dobrev, who is of course an independent military analyst, and he has penned in the past a couple of articles also highlighting some of the institutional, organizational, and industrial problems that the Russian Air Forces have. So without further ado, let's talk about the Russian air industry and why corruption is not necessarily the main problem.
Some years before Russia actually invaded Ukraine, now we had all these big announcements about the modernization program of the VKS. There's been a lot of media hype also surrounding this. And last time you were on, you talked sort of about the problems of the VKS itself. And now I want to turn this discussion over to the industry side of things. And I want to start this out with a very sort of naive question, right? How prepared is actually the Russian aerospace industry to fulfill the parameters of this modernization program that the Russian state has launched for the VKS?
To some degree, in certain areas like air defense, it's very well prepared to add more air defense. I don't think that fits the goals of the VKS that it has to cover. In other areas, however, they're hit by delays. They're hit by delays and cost overruns. And I think the estimates were in 2015, 2016 that they would need by the end of by the next 10 years. So in 3 to 4 years, they would need another 400, maybe 500 fighter bomber types. And I don't think that's something they have reached in terms of new procurement after the breakup of the Soviet Union. I have to check out the numbers, but I don't think that was the total procurement thus far in the last 30 years. So they're not prepared in that regard, just how many planes they're going to need to replace aging planes. They're not really prepared for the amount of new engines they have to build or the upgrades they have to provide for the existing fleet if they want to keep it. And I don't think they're prepared for the amount of munitions they had to prepare and build, and just to have the ready modern munitions in an industrial program to be delivered and just to ramp it up in some cases. I don't think that was in place. And I don't think they're really prepared for drastic 40, 50, 100 production runs every year. They're more on the slower side. While yes, there were years where they had more procurement than, and as a whole, they had more procurement as planes. They never really reached the level at which they want to be. If you see how long it takes for them to operate an aircraft, and if they start operating them at full levels, and if they have to also provide spares and a higher servicing, I don't think that's there. And also when it came to, this is sort of their own PR issues. In the past, we've had times where Rogozin, when he was still deputy prime minister, would state numbers of produced aircraft, and everyone would scratch their heads how he got to that figure. And then we'd say, well, maybe he counted all the domestically procured ones and then added all the exports and then added another 10, which was how he was stating how much was procured. The other thing is that they would say that modernization would hit a new high percentage, but sometimes that would require lowering down the threshold of what a modernized or modern aircraft means. So you didn't actually get as many modern aircraft. You got, some of them were halfway measures. So we accept that ones that were built in the last 10 years were sort of okay, and they were going to count them as modern, or we don't need that extensive a modernization program for this type to consider it modern. I don't think as a whole they were ready for this conflict. And also some of the cost-cutting measures they were doing at the aircraft factories was to reduce the number of working pensioners to basically reduce the burden on the budget. This was a program that was, for example, in KAS, it was being done to the effect of 2,000 people leaving the Tarstan plant. out of their core production staff. And again, that I want to mention it again because people keep saying that the defense minister who was removed, Serdyukov, was sort of removed as an industry versus attempts of reform. It was initiated by him as part of the board of directors of Rostech. So for me, it's a continuation of what was happening during his time in procurement, just more streamlined and less dysfunctional. And he was more of the fall guy for that. The initial stage of the reform turned out to be completely unfeasible. Not so much that he was ousted or that he was, and this goes on to the procurement and logistics and support, which was part of the reforms that didn't actually work. That's when you had a lot of cannibalization.
And you have sort of the development of, let's say, the planes that everybody always talks about, you know, the Sukhoi 57, then recently they came with that Checkmate. Then there's the starting Tupolev 160 production. All of this requires expertise, innovation, funding, imports of technology as well, considering what's available natively in Russia. And what are sort of the main challenges would you say of, let's assume they can pull this off, but what are the main challenges of that hold Russia back in these measures?
Well, one example would be that, like I mentioned, staff was being reduced as the program was being announced. So it was at the same plant that is going to now restart to 160 production, but this plant has had its staff reduced over the last 10 years. It's continuously shedding staff, and that's trained staff because these aren't towns that can actually import a lot of new labor.
Yeah.
Even though Tatarstan is a large regional center and it's a sort of a separate entity with different internal dynamics than, let's say, other parts of Russia, but the staff isn't quite there, and the funding it's underappreciated how much funds they're going to need to restart this at the same level. One of the things that was happening at the same time as the 160 program was being restarted was that the 22 program was being drastically reduced. Now they're going to modernize maybe 2 or 3 airframes out of the entire fleet of close to 60, which is still on the books in the VKS. So that fleet just remains largely obsolete. And we've seen it try to launch older generation missiles at ground targets with abysmal effects.
Yeah.
And again, this is an airplane that has a radar from the 70s. For instance, if you want to check the old reference manuals, you can, because it hasn't been upgraded that much. They've only been upgraded with limited upgrades for communications and bombing site for free-falling bombs. Which isn't that significant.
Yeah.
It still lacks a lot of things. And another example of how these challenges weren't fully appreciated was when they were trying to do the new modernized versions of the Il-76. It turned out that their bill of materials, and I have to check the number exactly, but they were off by I think 1 billion rubles per plane, which is, I have to check the exact numbers, but they just missed something like 30 to 40% of the cost of the plane where they were initially calculating how much it's going to cost.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a program that didn't have serious political interest in it. So at the time, Rogozin was still deputy prime minister because he had to deal with procurement, not just his current role at Roscosmos. And his son was in IL as senior director who was focusing on this specific thing, and the program didn't go. Another weird example was the testing where they recently lost a prototype now I think over a year ago. In that case, when they lost the prototype and its engine caught fire, we remember the video, when they were trying to find it in the residential areas next to the airfield, the firefighters got lost, which is part of the issue of that industry's main testing center and how the infrastructure was set up there. So that is also another issue of, it's not just that you have to feed the plant, you have to feed the airfields around it, you have to feed the services around it, and then you can build the entire program.
I mean, it is one of the enigmas for me of how the Russian defense industry actually works, because in the West, we tend to have this sort of stereotypical image, right? It's the Russians are going to have simple, down-to-earth engineering. It's going to be cost-effective. You hit it with a hammer 3 times, and it's just going to work, even though I wouldn't advise that with aircraft. Reality, of course, different to that stereotypical image, but considering the money that apparently gets spent on the military, specifically the VKS and the industry, how are you getting the things that you're getting out of this industry and the modernization that is going on? And where, you've already mentioned decreasing staff, where is cost cutting happening, and where is that money actually going?
Cost cutting is happening at that point. Sometimes they're just reducing staff.
Yeah.
And this has happened not just in the aerospace industry, this has happened in the shipbuilding programs, this has happened in the tank building and in the ground forces procurement. But that's where the cost cutting is happening. Is that where the bulk of the expenses are? Not exactly. And is that, so one of the problems is that, for instance, if you have delays, they don't, and you have issues delivering things, the plant keeps operating, because this plant is also a jobs program for the government.
Yeah.
If the plant doesn't work and it doesn't provide salaries, that's a problem. But if the plant also has high levels of corruption, which steals money, or it's unable to produce things on time or at the required specification, sometimes you do have, I think the most recent case was where the person who was in charge of the VKS's radio electronic equipment procurement. And again, we're not talking about a low-ranking officer, we're talking about a high-ranking officer. One of the charges against him, and he was arrested for that, was for lying about whether Almaz-Antey reached the specification for the radar they were providing them. So that's one way you can not deliver what was expected, but hide it and lower the expectations or sign off on it. A lot of that is happening, and let's say that money is being stolen within the local structures. Also, because again, if the money is stolen and the plant doesn't work, but it has orders, it continues to acquire debt.
Yeah.
The debt, because of the structure of the Russian banking system after 2013, when private banks that are large almost completely disappeared. They had a huge collapse of the banking system, not entirely linked to sanctions and the devaluation of the ruble, just terrible business practices hitting a general economic hiccup. But in that case, again, if this factory goes into bankruptcy, the company the bank that is going to want to get its money back isn't a private bank. It's going to usually be a state bank, or a bank which is private but with connections to the state, that it can explain what happens if I don't get my 20 billion back. And that is where then a lot of the money goes in to sustain those things. At the end of the year, the Ministry of Finance just goes through what's happening and just sends off a bunch of money here, here, and here to sustain things. And now the other thing is that, for again, an example, Kazan, where if they start doing cost-cutting measures and people getting cut, that's not going to reduce the inefficiency of the plant. It's not going to also reduce the reality that they have another helicopter plant in Ulan-Ude, and that's also regional employer, so you have to keep both of them, even though the price of the helicopters differs vastly. Now, it's different modifications of the helicopter, but still the difference is substantial. But then if people start getting replaced there in Tatarstan, you usually have senior officials of the local government, the president or the prime minister of the republic, getting on the board of the company and saying, this is a large employer, now you need to send money to stabilize it or to support the community around it. Because he doesn't have as much protection from local population as Moscow has, or the heads of the corporation have, which are far away. He is connected to the people there. And that's where you get the other friction, and that's how you also end up with money being sent. It's not always a case of just outright corruption. Like I said, sometimes as things get more expensive, you have to reevaluate the bill of materials, And just because you signed the contract with the government 3 or 4 years earlier doesn't mean you can sustain the same cost, and that's where you get the adjustment. And in the case, Ilyushin built the first few examples and said, yeah, this is how much it's going to cost you. We can either deliver half the airplanes or you can give us more money.
Right.
And also you have to recapitalize us for our expenses because we kept working. And again, while there's a lot of spending, it's not a lot of spending to sustain procurement at high levels where you have spits and you have short sprints of activity at a certain area, and then you stop and that plant starts to accumulate debt and issues.
Right.
And
yeah, I was just wondering, considering that as well, how reliant is then Russia actually on imports of technology and technical devices? Because we've seen like cockpits of Russian aircraft that have like civilian GPS units in there, and there, I think there was this one famous picture. I'm not quite sure if it has been confirmed, but of these handwritten GPS coordinates on a piece of paper that the pilot was using over Ukraine. Because of the lack of actually high-tech modern equipment that you would find in Western countries and in NATO air forces. So where's the reliance there? And I assume now with sanctions it's very difficult, but how has that been over the last couple of or the last decade specifically?
They've been reliant to a large degree. Now, I think that that's a bit overblown because when it comes to now certain specifics of, let's say, engine manufacture and the metallurgy there and certain materials when it comes to that, those will be harder to replace. But just general purpose screens, if you're going to have a glass cockpit, that would be easier to replace because this is a priority. But generally, those things have been a lot more expensive and they'll continue to be more expensive. They have the option of actually sanction busting in terms of those, because at the end of the day, we're talking about building several more to 160s. We're not talking about hundreds. Similar things, we're talking about dozens of planes. We're not talking about, let's say, equipping all of the ground forces tanks with thermal imagers from France, which is something they can do for the commander at least. This is the Reliance will add a cost to this. They can bypass it. I think they're more reliant when it comes to engine technology for larger aircraft, not so much for their fighters, although they might have issues with the certain alloys and their procurement. Now, that being said, this isn't going to help an industry that's already struggling to put out the numbers it has been putting out. And it's putting them out not at the cost that's being mentioned, but at a cost plus, again, like I said, cheaper loans from the banks, no penalties when you prolong a government contract. All those things are adding up. And that will be a hurdle, which will also be harder to do because right now there's a specific way you do sanction busting or parallel imports, which requires a lot more structures within the government to help you to move the money or to find an external source. So you would need a dedicated channel. And an example for that is how, again, a completely different industry, but yesterday they announced that the lead industry is suffering in Russia because someone decided, because we're in a special military operation, we can't export lead. Okay, we're not exporting lead. But then because it's a special military operation, lead became a special good. And they just then found out that lead depends on exports because there's not as much domestic demands. And for the time for the industry to signal this to the government and the government to take action and to have someone within the official structure that's going to allow them to export or to find another purpose to activate, that takes weeks to months. So that will be a hurdle in these cases as well. Sometimes not seeing Russia spending its limited foreign currency also means that critical industries can't find the people who sign the paperwork fast enough for them to get things. It's not that they don't need them.
Right. And then the question that I would have there, considering this semi-reliance on foreign imports, how does it look in Russia itself, you have, of course, the defense industry, but then you also have the civilian aviation industry. And what are sort of the connections there? Like, how split are they? How connected are they? How does it work in terms of also perhaps that the civilian industry is able to perhaps assist the military industry in overcoming some of these challenges, or is that not happening at all?
Well, the civilian industry is suffering a lot more.
Okay.
Because it's now, again, Russia it will have a hard time ramping up production of, let's say, types like 214, which is only used in limited numbers by the military. But the problem is that the local types are a lot more heavily reliant on foreign imports, because you need more to replace the civilian aircraft in use. And for example, the Sukhoi Superjet, even though it has significant issues with cracks in the inside of, I think, the chamber where you actually burn things. Sorry for the non-technical term, I'm forgetting it right now.
Combustion chamber, or?
Yes, it has cracks in the combustion chamber between 2,000 and 4,000 hours of flight time in the engine, which is something they were expecting at, let's say, 8 to 10,000.
Yeah.
And that's why it's an inefficient airplane, because it needs a lot more engine maintenance. And that's why the largest external operator just returned all of them from, it was a Mexican company.
Okay.
But yes, even then, those engines are reliant on French technology. And Russian domestic types are inefficient. So the domestic large transports that can be built completely domestically, if you replace parts with what is available, would not be very efficient aircraft, and that would severely impact Aeroflot, which is going to be likely the lifeline of the Russian civil aviation. It's already had issues when Transaero collapsed several years back, and they had to bail out a lot of the remaining pilots, had to have jobs for them, and they sort of held them back from leaving to work in foreign companies by not so much on purpose, but because the system for issuing certificates was delayed. Right. And they also have considerable issues with just training civil pilots, because they were dependent on the Ulyanovsk flight school, which is for civilian aviators, but they didn't have enough planes. So they didn't get enough planes to certify them. And then when you see commentaries from people who were connected to the civil aviation, they were saying that we're actually getting people who can't fly planes, and I have to put them on the plane because he's not trained well enough. Again, that's a direct interview with the CEO of a company. But this was the issue with the Russian civil aviation, and it hasn't gotten any better. And also, again, the Sukhoi Superjet is an interesting example, because Sukhoi was dependent on that project being at least semi-successful. So when the Mexican company returned the planes and they were no longer being leased, again, the lifeline is Aeroflot. Aeroflot is just going to absorb your fleet.
Right.
Usually, again, this is a sort of a one side of the government paying for the other side of the government, but this isn't generating anything if, let's say, for the next several years, Aeroflot is going to be a loss-making operation and it's going to need substantial subsidies from the government. And on top of that, you need a lot of money to restart domestic large civilian aircraft construction, and you also need to replace a lot of the parts and to get them either to absorb the cost of them being inefficient or to get them to the point where they're efficient enough to be operated. This is just an entire set of circumstances that are combining into sort of a perfect storm.
Yeah.
And like I said, while I see it that there are challenges for the military which can be overcome, the military doesn't really have that requirement to operate very efficiently their aircraft and make money off of them.
Yeah.
That civil aviation does.
That's true. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so to round this up, I asked you this question on the last interview, and it's the same question again. What sort of recommendation do you have for people to look at what sort of sources and where they can find information? Again, if there's anything in English, let us know. If not, we'll make do with auto translate, I guess.
I'm saying that you might have to make do with auto translate again, because again, this big piece on missing the bill of material cost of the 076, that was in Kommersant. The big yearly exposés on what's happening in CAS, those are in a regional paper. They're not even in a national size paper, even though it's significant. They're in Business Online, which is a newspaper, or Business Gazeta, which is actually based in Tatarstan. It's a local business news letter, which is focusing on those issues. And a lot of the times you can find that information in local news or in business news when they do a focus on a certain industry. But if you want to see what's happening in a certain area, find at least the federal districts that combines them, and find outlets there, and just, again, also don't try to Google it right now, because you might not get all the results. Try Yandex.
Right. Okay. Yes. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stanimir. That was very insightful, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise on this.
My pleasure.
So I hope you enjoyed that and learned something from it. As always, big thank you to my patrons and channel members who make this channel possible. And at this point, there's just one thing left to say. Go out there, meet with your friends and family, enjoy the rest of your day, and have a good one, and see you in the sky.